And there's nothing really more intimidating than introducing the President of the United States as our guest speaker. But in fact, that's what Mr. Broski is known for, and his knowledge of the 16th President and his portrayal of the 16th President are important parts of our understanding and living history. And the portrayal of the President to child and adult audiences throughout the Southern California area has been a part of his life and of historical organizations' lives for a number of years. Ladies and gentlemen, the President.
Springfield. I certainly hope someday to come back and take up where I left off. Herndon. Please keep that plaque up above our office door. Lincoln and Herndon. My friends, no one here can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I've lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born and one is buried. I now leave not knowing when or whether ever I shall return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. And without the help of that divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that help, I cannot fail. Trusting in him to go with me and to remain with you and to be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. Commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. Well, how do, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Abraham Lincoln. I am your 16th President of these great United States. I am standing before you to proclaim that as the President, I have taken the solemn oath to uphold our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and our Declaration of Independence, of which I was sworn to do. I believe that in contemplation of universal law and of this Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. It is my duty to preserve, protect, and defend this country against all aggressors, foreign and domestic. My intent is a free and prosperous people in a free and prosperous land. Now, these are my beliefs, my ideals, the standards by which I govern this great country by. But they were challenged, weren't they? While I was still in Springfield. I was elected in November, and by December, 7 states decided to leave the Union. Can they do that? Just get up and walk out? In my opinion, no, they cannot do that. It is my duty to bring them back. What was the cause of all this? Why did they feel that now is the time to do that? And as you know, many years we have been debating, well, from our founding, what do we do with this institution of slavery? And for the past 25 years, we've always come up with a compromise, some agreement that kept the powers equal in the North and the South. But why now? Sadly, I think part of it was myself. This Republican, who they felt, if I were to become president, that I would come down there and abolish their peculiar institution. Though many times I stated that I cannot do that. It is not within my power to do that. And I would just as soon leave you alone. My only schism or my only complaint was that let's not let it spread to the new territories. But once I was elected, they thought differently. Now I pretty much had to wait in Springfield, obviously, until I was sworn in, but that didn't stop some of the people. Now many of them came by and sent me letters of congratulations. They were thanking me for being president. And we had parties going on, and Mary just loved that immensely. But I had also received letters from down south. They were warning me that if I were to enter Washington, they would assassinate me. I was still in Springfield. Now I would read these letters, and of course Mary knew about them, and you know how Mary is. She was terrified. She didn't know what to do. Myself, if I were to worry about it, would I get anything done? And I felt that if someone was going to assassinate me, they would do it. There's not much we can do about it. So I pretty much just bundled them up in a string, and I tucked them in my desk and just moved on. Well, I brought up Mary. It's kind of interesting, our relationship, Mary and I. This country bumpkin who grew up out west, way out west in Kentucky, out in the frontier where there's more trees than there are people. How did I ever get to meet this young lady, Miss Todd? It's kind of interesting. As you know, growing up, I wanted to educate myself. I wanted to learn. My father, being a farmer, and I a farmer's son, he taught me how to work hard on the farm. He didn't teach me how to love it. I kind of wanted to use my brain more than my brawn. And this was a time in our country where things were changing. People were moving into the city, the big city. They were working for somebody else. My father's generation, it wasn't like that. If you were a tradesman or a farmer, you worked for yourself. You would take maybe a young'un underneath you, you were their mentor, and then when they got educated, they would move on and they would be their own boss, their own employee or employer. But things were changing with me. They had more opportunities. And I wanted to strive for that. Well, my father, of course, didn't care for that too much. Because what good is a book out in the frontier in the winter when you're starving to death? Or you're freezing to death? Now, can you eat a book? It doesn't come out good in the end. So whenever there was a time that, let's say I was behind the ox and I was hoeing a row, and I'd get to the end and I'd want to sit down under a tree and rest the ox. Well, what would I do? I'd pull a book out and start reading. Well, the neighbors would see this and they'd say, look at that young Abe. Look how lazy he is. That would get back to my father. He would come out and he'd chastise me and I'd get back behind there again. Now my mother had a different idea. She wanted my older sister Sarah and I to be educated. And so did my stepmother. Sadly, after my mother passed away from milk sickness, my father left my older sister and I and my cousin to fend for ourselves for about a year as he went back east to try to find an old sweetheart that he had. Well, he found her. He hauled her back out there to Kentucky with her 3 children, and we were a big, happy family. But she wanted us to be educated. And as you know, I was educated a little here and a little there. Well, what does that mean? Well, we could only go to school a little time. Out there in the frontier in a cabin about 16 by 18, when all that white stuff is on the ground, you think we drove our parents crazy? So they said, get on down the hall, or farmer down the road there, he's got a little more education than anybody else. So he was the schoolmaster. And my father, being a carpenter also, he would maybe make a chair, or my mother would make some preserves or something, and that would pay for our education for that time period, that season. Once the snow melted, we were back out there on the farm again. Well, I must admit that my father and I didn't have a very good relationship. I want to apologize for that now. I did help him build his last cabin outside of Decatur when I was 21 and then headed out on my own. But after that, when he had gotten sick, I didn't go visit him. And when he passed away, I didn't go to the funeral. And it took me like 10 years before I put a grave marker on his grave. I apologize for that. That wasn't the right thing to do. I didn't do everything right. But what he did teach me was to help people, besides working hard. So I learned from him, because there were many times if a barn burned down, he was the first one there to help. Or if there was a church raising or something like someone needed some help, he was one of the first ones there. So I learned that to help people. Every job I had, I helped somebody. At 21, I moved to New Salem. I was a little more educated than a lot of the other people. So I worked in the post office. I was the postmaster of that post office. I was a postmaster because there was only one employee there. What did that do? That allowed me to read the newspapers before I handed them out. Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. I got to read these papers and to know what's going on in this country of ours. I was always fascinated with learning and learning and learning and helping. Now, as a young lad, we had to move a couple times because my father, who was, I guess you could say he was illiterate, he could sign his name and he could maybe read a little bit, but that was about it. He had bought some land in Kentucky, and Kentucky at this time was frontier, and the boundaries were not very precise. So the landowner would come and say, hey, this is my land. So we had to move a couple times because of that. So in my later years as a teenager, I said, well, I want to be a land surveyor, so that if a farmer wanted to buy some land, I want to make sure that it was his land and nobody else's. So what did I do? I opened up some books. I read all the books I could on that, mentored under another land surveyor, and I became a land surveyor. And eventually I worked in a mercantile as a shopkeeper, and that's where I got that nickname of myself, for myself, Honest Abe. Honestly, I guess it's okay. I don't really care for that too much, Honest Abe. But I got that because one day a lady came in and she wanted to buy some coffee. Well, I used the wrong weights, because we had a set of scales back then. We had no fancy machines. And you put the brass weights on one side and the product on the other side. Well, I used the wrong weights, and I had overcharged her like 4 cents. You don't overcharge somebody 4 cents. So at the end of the day, when I tallied it all up, I realized I had overcharged her. So I walked the 2 or 3 miles to her farm and gave it back to her. Well, in a small community of about 100, that got around pretty good, didn't it? So that's how I kind of got my nickname, Honest Abe. Well, there was a gentleman there that I knew, and he said, Mr. Lincoln, because you like to help people, have you ever thought of becoming a lawyer? I said, well, that's not a bad idea. No, I never thought of that. So then he said, tell you what, we went to his place, he opened up, though it was a closet, he opened up his door there, his library, and he said, start here, read every book in here, and when you get done reading the books, we'll go take you before the, well, a board. It was just some judges, and you could become a lawyer, an attorney. So I said, that's not a bad idea. It took me way over a year to read every book in there, but I wanted to accomplish this. I had the desire to do it, so I did it. So then I became a lawyer. Well, how many lawyers do you need in New Salem, a small town? Not too many. When Springfield was growing up, it had 1,500 people. That's a lot of people. So I strove off to Springfield. This is in Illinois, of course. And when I got into town, I stopped at a mercantile because I'm familiar with mercantiles. I got off my horse and I walked in. Joshua Speed was there behind the counter. I said, sir, but I didn't know what the name was, sir, if I may purchase a blanket and a pillow and a mattress or some kind of a cot, I cannot pay you now, but when I get a job and I become successful, I will pay you back for what this costs. And so he kind of looked at me and he thought about it a minute, and he kind of looked at my sad face and he said, tell you what, Mr. Lincoln, you take your stuff upstairs and you can move in with me. So I took my saddlebags off. In 30 seconds, I was moved in. So here I was in Springfield. Well, there was a gentleman in Springfield who had petitioned for me to come to Springfield. His name was John Stewart. He was a lawyer already, and he kind of was looking for a partner. So I kind of got in with him, and he was my mentor to learn even more about being a lawyer. And at one time, us sitting around just chit-chatting, he said, Mr. Lincoln, you're such a sad, quiet person. how are you going to ever get any clients with this attitude or with this facial expression? So he said, tell you what, there is a dance, a cotillion up the hill at the kind of a hoity-toity area. I am inviting you to come up there for the dance. Well, of course I was nervous about it. I wasn't too sure if I wanted to go or not. I finally got up enough nerve, and of course I was late. I walked into this room, and it's probably about this side, maybe a little bit smaller, and it was already going on. They were dancing around, they were chit-chatting, and over in the corner, there was a group of gentlemen standing around in a circle. They were laughing and carrying on, and what I noticed between their legs, there was a couple of high-heel shoes, or some shoes there with a skirt. This, in a way, was rather scandalous for one young lady to be entertained by that many gentlemen. So I wanted to find out who this was and something about her. So when I finally did realize who she was, it took me about half the evening. I finally walked up there and I said, Miss Todd, I would like to dance with you in the worst way. She accepted me. And what we did is we did dance around. But me with my big old clodhopper shoes, I stepped on her feet. Of course I apologized, and we danced again. And then I kicked her in the shin. She went back to her girlfriend and said, Mr. Lincoln wanted to dance with me in the worst way. And he most certainly did. The thing about this is that this young lady was different than the other ladies. Why? She was educated. She was very outspoken, but she was educated. She knew French, etiquette, she knew politics. This was unheard of for a young lady to know politics. And she knew history, she knew all kinds of things, and that was fascinating with her. And so her and I talked for the rest of the evening until it was time for me to leave, which was one of the last ones to leave. Now she didn't leave because that was her sister's house. Elizabeth and her husband, Ninian Edwards, lived in Springfield. She came out from Lexington where she was born because she was getting old. She was 21 years old, and she will 21. She was at that, and she was still not married. That's old. That's an old lady back then. So she came out to find some new beaux out there in Springfield because she didn't care for any of the gentlemen back in Lexington. And so that's why she was there at the Edwards house. And from that evening on, her and I would talk, and we kind of started, I guess you could say, seeing each other. That would, of course, be chaperoned. I would go up there, or at least I would let Ninian know that I would like to come in and sit a while with his, what would that be, his niece? His sister-in-law. I'm terrible with that. And so he said, well, okay, you may come in. And what he would do, we didn't have it here today, there's a lamp that has oil in it, very small, it's got a wick on it. Well, they would fill that up with as much oil as they wanted your time to be with the other person. And they would light it and set it down, and I would sit there and we would chit-chat in the parlor and talk about things. And when that burned out, it was time for me to go home. And of course, with me, he didn't put too much oil in there. Because I was this country bumpkin. I wasn't the society that Mary Todd was. Her father was a politician, he was a businessman, he had cotton manufacturing, and it was their responsibility, Elizabeth and Ninian, to find a suitable suitor for her. I wasn't it. So they didn't care for me right off the bat. So we started seeing each other for about a year, and then I finally got cold feet. I said, Mary, I cannot keep you in the luxury that you are used to. I'm sorry, we must break it off. I felt miserable. Mary felt miserable. My friends took my knives away from me because they thought that I was going to do myself in. And I was moping around, she was moping around, and eventually Mary's girlfriend said, Mary, we've had enough. So they secretly got us both together at a friend's house, and they locked us in the parlor, and they said, you two work it out. So we started seeing each other on the side, because I knew her sister wouldn't approve of it. And after a while, this was a year in between. Mary waited for me. I don't know why, but she waited for me. Well, I do know why. When she was a young girl, she had told her girlfriends that someday I will marry a man who will be President of the United States. That is documented. What she saw in me, I had no idea that she saw that someday I may be President of the United States. So then after about a year of not seeing each other, then we got together again. And of course, a fine gentleman I am, I would go up to Ninian and then I would ask for Mary's hand in marriage, wouldn't I? Well, that's if I was a fine gentleman. I kind of chickened out on that. And being as strong-willed as Mary was, she went up to her sister and said, I'm going to marry that man, Mr. Lincoln, and there's not a thing you can do about it. And she said, no, you're not. And then she said, well, if you were to get married, you're going to be married in our house. But tonight I have an engagement, so you can get married tomorrow night. So we got married in that house, and we lived happily ever after, didn't we? Yeah, now Mary was rather high-strung, but she had issues. And why did she have issues? Her childhood may sound nice. I mean, her father, Robert Todd, Todd is spelled T-O-D-D when God only needs one D for his name. So that tells you something about the Todds. But when she was a young girl of 6 years old, her mother passed away. Now, they had 7 children already. She was one of 7 children. Well, when her father remarried again, they decided to have 9 more. 16 children in that family. Sadly, 2 of them had passed away when they were really young, probably right after childbirth. So, but there was 16 children. And the stepmother didn't care too much for the first batch. So Mary was sent off to finishing school. She would leave on Monday and then not come back until Friday. So she got to learn all of this education. And her father believed that women should be educated. So then he really pushed for her to be educated in politics and everything else. So that's kind of something about Mary. Well, that was rather traumatic. So many times she lived with her grandmother. And of course her grandmother finally passed away. And then growing up, think of the woman that I took her from that luxury where she had a slave nanny taking care of her. Every child in that family had a nanny that would wake them up in the morning and they would stand there and they'd dress them and they would feed them and they would take care of them and help educate them and everything else. I took her from that to where we moved in the room above a Globe Tavern. So above a bar is where we moved into. And she adapted pretty well to that, and especially with our children and you know, and taking care of them and everything else. So I really appreciate that. But think about it, this woman, our second child, Eddie, passed away when he was 3 years old from sickness. I mean, he stayed in the family until he died. And then our other son, Willie, had passed away before he became an adult. And eventually, Thomas. So there was a lot of tragedy in her life. And then something, I don't know what, something happened to her husband too later on. And so she had a lot of trauma in her life. And then also when we were in Washington or even back in Springfield, there were times when I'd have to go off and do a speaking engagement or something. I would have to have someone come over and stay with her. Why? Because she was deathly afraid of lightning and thunder. And also shadows. Back then, they didn't have this fancy floodlights. It was either light or dark. A candle or a lantern was light and then dark. So she was very nervous, very scared of all this. So yes, she did definitely have her challenges in her life, and I pretty much accepted that. And many times when she would overdo something and get bent out of, well, you would say bent out of shape. I would say that, and start arguing and just getting all flustered and everything. I would say, well, it doesn't do me much harm, her doing that, and at the end of it, it makes her feel so good, so I just pretty much let her rant and rave. But one thing about her and her upbringing, when she talked about her girlfriends and said that she would marry a man who would become president, she was pretty much behind getting me elected. Her father being a politician, her father knew Henry Clay and other politicians. So Mary, behind my back, would kind of be poking and shoving and making agreements, making deals here and there, kind of to help me along. And when I did become president, and it came to the Springfield Telegraph office that I had been elected president, before I did any celebrating with the gentlemen there and their cigars and their whiskey and everything else, I said, excuse me, there was a short little lady back home that wants to hear the good news. And as I traveled back to our house, I was shouting out, Mary, they have elected us. So, yeah, so she's the one who pretty much pushed me along. So that's got a little something about my life there. So, let me see, where was I before I started chit-chatting like that? Well, I know. My secretary, Nicolay, had said that there was well, here it is, a report. That's a report. It's from the telegraph office in the War Department. It says that General Lee of the Confederacy and his Army of Northern Virginia is rumored to be traveling up the Shenandoah Valley into Pennsylvania. Robert is invading the North. What is his goal? What is his strategy? Is his destination Harrisburg? Is it Philadelphia? Is it Washington City? Lee's advance is a bold move by a man who has not yet been defeated by our best. And up north, the crops are pert near ripe in the fields, the orchards are full, and livestock is plentiful, all pretty much untouched by war. You see, the North has been spared the utter devastation experienced by most rebellious states, but, well, that may change now. The newspapers are saying doom and destruction. The public is in a panic, but I'm somewhat elated. I guess you could say I'm kind of jubilant. Lee's bold move is a break from his usual conservative defensive battle plans. He's out ahead of his supply lines now. He's vulnerable. I would say he's in our grasp, finally. But sadly, the battle up north didn't turn out the way either of us had hoped. Lee did not get his victory, and I did not get his total defeat. But it wasn't a total loss. The undefeatable was defeated, and I believe it was the high point of the rebellion. I believe that it had crested. But at what cost? And then the war went on. But a couple months later, let's see. On my desk here, here it is. I received an invitation to an event. This is just one of many invitations that I received, but rarely accepted because I'm so busy. But this one here, dated November 2nd by David Wills. This one I wanted to attend. Is it because it's going to honor those who gave their lives in one of our bloodiest battles? Yes. Is it because I wanted to participate in one of the first national soldier cemeteries dedicated to the Civil War? Yes. And I also wanted to hear the oration by Edward Everett, a renowned speaker. Yes, I also wanted to hear that. But I also wanted the opportunity to speak to the citizens of this country and to the world about this conflict that we are in, and to offer condolences and encouragement to those that are most affected by it. So I boarded the train. I had to leave my Molly in Washington City because our son Thomas was too ill to eat his breakfast that morning. The doctors believe he has a mild case of scarlet fever, but this is especially hard on Mary because last year we had lost our beloved Willie to typhoid fever, and she is still grieving. She begged me not to go and threatened that if her little Taddy were to die, that she would surely go insane. But you see, I had to go. This country is in turmoil. There has not been a decisive victory for many months, leaving no glimmer of hope to a nation weary of bloodshed. But then, in the summer out west along the Mississippi River, Vicksburg had finally fallen to General Grant's 47-day siege. The Father of Waters once more flows unvexed to the sea. But this wasn't the reason for my travels. Hundreds of miles east of Vicksburg and about 80 miles north of Washington, another victory had also made the papers, and I wanted to be there for that celebration. No, for that dedication. So, leaving Washington and unboarding the train there, I settled in at the Wills house, and I took a walk at sunset to gather my thoughts for the events of tomorrow. When I think of all the sacrifices of life given and those yet to be offered before this dreadful war is over, my heart is like lead within me, and I feel at times like hiding in deep darkness. You see, I've gazed long into the eyes of grieving mothers. I've wept with widows. I've held tight the hands of dying soldiers. When will all of this end? The nation is asking me this question. I don't have an answer. But I've always desired to conduct the affairs of this administration to the best of my ability, and if at the end I've lost every other friend on earth, I shall at least have one friend left, and that friend shall be down inside me. So, here we are, Thursday, November 19th. Following a procession of over 1,000 soldiers, we've entered Evergreen Cemetery, where I am now standing here before you on this platform. And those thoughts of last night come back to me now. On this ground in early July of this year, 1863, history was made. Men gave their lives for what they believed, with raised arms. Cheers were lifted up, along with prayers. You see, both sides read the same Bible. They pray to the same God, but the prayers of both could not be answered. And for now, the cannons are silent. The muskets have all been stacked aside. There's a solemn presence blanketing these few acres here like an early morning fog. The earth beneath our feet is quietly shouting. Here lies a soldier, a comrade, a hero. Here lies a father, a brother, a son. We are assembled here today to honor those who fought and died on these surrounding battlefields. I have been asked as chief executive of the nation to formally set apart these grounds to their sacred use by a few appropriate remarks. Can this be accomplished? Standing here before you, many thoughts travel through my mind, and gazing out over the rolling hills, the gentle valleys, the grass is blowing in the breeze. I can see the markers, the mounds of earth, the wooden boxes. Can there be an explanation for such a scene? Can it be comfort for all the sorrow? Would you tell a mother to ease the pain of her son not coming home? What words you use for a wife whose husband won't be returning to her? How do you explain to a young child that her father won't be there to see her grow? How do you relate that? Well, it was for the right reason. It was for freedom. It was to preserve the Union. What words do you utter? What letters do you write? What address do you speak? "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We're met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It's altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government, of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you very much. At this time, I would like to answer any questions that you might have for me. We will start, here we go, we have the first question. I was going to start with the second question, but I'm glad to. Yes, my dear.
Can you explain how you changed the goal of the war from preserving the Union to abolishing slavery?
Well, I really didn't change that. It changed kind of on its own. I have always been an anti-slavery. I'm not an abolitionist. I didn't want to go that far. They were rather radical back then. I mean, you know, they would like kill people and throw printing presses into the ocean or into the water. So I didn't want to be known as an abolitionist. But from a childhood, my father being a strong Baptist, moving from Kentucky to Indiana because Indiana was a free state, and also when we were living on Knob Creek, our homestead there, the Cumberland Trail was right there. And as a young child, I would see slaves, people chained together. And so from a young child, I knew that that wasn't right, that one man should not own another man. And you may think, well, what about Mary Lincoln? Once she married me, she was not a Todd anymore. And nobody would go up to her and call her Mary Todd anymore. She would correct them. She is Mary Lincoln. And Mary Lincoln, even though she grew up with slaves, she disliked slavery herself. So, as President of the United States, I had said something earlier, I could not abolish slavery. That's Congress passes laws, not the President. It didn't matter how I felt. And so, as President, my duty, sworn duty, was to bring the Union back together. I am a strong constitutionalist. I'm also a strong Declaration of Independence. That's why I stress is that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal. The Declaration of Independence to me is our aspirations, inspiration to get to where we want to be, and our Constitution is how we're getting there. Of course we're not there yet, but that's how we're getting there. So I'm stronger on that than the Constitution. But in the Constitution, for me, was to bring the Union back together. Now think about it. If right off the bat, if I said, we're going to go down south and we're going to free all the slaves, do you think a northern soldier is going to give his life for a lowly slave? Not really, no. Now, with the Emancipation Proclamation, like you're saying, though from the beginning, I think both sides, honestly, they knew that the North was going to win eventually. The longer the war took, the less chance of the South, because they didn't have the manufacturing, they didn't have the population, they didn't have the support from Europe, they didn't have anything other than tenacity to survive. And they knew that, even they knew that it wasn't going to last very long. But the public was against me, the newspapers were against me, the politicians were against me. They were saying, let them go, just start their own country. I could not allow that to happen. Where would it end? They left. And then, what was it earlier? New York wanted to leave, Texas wanted to leave, oh my gosh. So eventually now we would have 50 separate states. I cannot allow that to happen. But as a politician, you can tell I'm kind of going around your question, aren't I? Yeah, I love to talk. So, yes, so I could not say that. And then the Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure. So what that did was, it did a lot and it did very little. The big thing to me was that if a slave came up north, we didn't have to send them back. The Fugitive Slave Act was abolished. To me, that's a big thing, because then that meant, or that said something to the slave down south, is, oh, I don't have to go all the way up to freezing Canada. I can come up north and I can be free. And so it gave them, and it would disrupt the South. Now in the North, because, well, now don't tell anybody, but we had 1 million slaves up north, okay? We didn't have the plantation because it was rocky soil. It just didn't, it wasn't the agrarian like it was down south, because it just wasn't feasible. But those slaves up north they were a lot of craftsmen. They worked in the factories. They worked in the houses as servants, cooks, metal, what do you call them?
Urgents.
Thank you. So yes, they would work with the trades. So we had about 1 million up north. So if someone came from down south, they could assimilate them a heck of a lot better. So the newspapers and everybody else kind of changed it. Oh, well, now we're fighting to free the slaves. And I lost many Union soldiers. They gave up and they went back home. Nope, I'm not going to give my life for a slave. And it really infuriated the South. They actually fought harder, because now there was more that we were, grumbling about. And okay, now we don't like this any more than we liked it before. So I would say I don't think I ever actually came out and said that that's what we're fighting for, but it just kind of ended up being that, to where now we're fighting for the slaves. Okay, well then okay, let's leave it at that. But after the war ended, that war measure disappeared. So that's why we needed to pass the 13th Amendment. Yes, sir. Which way? I got two of you now. Which one first? Okay, in the back. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, I don't think anybody doubts that you were always against slavery. You were not an abolitionist, but you were against slavery. But in August 1862, you met a group of black clergymen, and you said, it is better that we should part. That we're too different. I could not change it if I would. Now, many professors have said that had to do with slavery, but Lincoln himself never, I don't think, would say that unless he meant it. Did you change your mind about whether whites and blacks could live together?
No, and I honestly don't know. Think about it. How many do we have in here? We still have a Chisholm, don't we? And at that time, that's what I felt, is that they are not going to blend the way we hoped they would. So I did comment, I did say that many times, and I would say it again now, and I think it is true. Now, what I did learn, like from Frederick Douglass and others that came to me, I learned their perspective, because I didn't have that. Even though I was born in a southern state, a southerner, I didn't have that interaction with the slaves or the freed slaves that much. So I entertained them as much as I could in Washington, so that I could get an idea of what they were thinking, what their desire was. But I always knew all along that one man should not own another man. And it's just funny when you say that. Well, let's turn that around. And instead of you owning him, let's have him own you. Nobody ever volunteered that, did they? No, isn't that kind of strange? Yes. So I did say that. Now, if you wanted to bring up Liberia, that started before I was even president. Did I like that idea? Okay, yes. Was it the best idea? No, it wasn't the best idea. But I felt it was an alternative, and it was only for those that wanted to go. Now, of course, there was some pressuring there too. So it sounds great to say, okay, only if you want to go. Okay, I want to go. Okay, no, I don't want to go. But there was also pressure in the back for that. Let's pay for it. Let's just ship some out. So it wasn't as nice as it sounded, and of course, it wasn't once they got there. No, it was kind of, you could say, it wasn't the best choice. But it was one of, let's say, three. So, yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you, Mr. President. History says that the conflict started with the takeover of Fort Sumter.
Correct.
Did your administration have any plans for a military intervention before the fort was taken over?
Heck no. I could not be the aggressor. that would have started off worse than it did with Manassas and all that. But that would have, because they were already calling me that. So no, I could not fire the first shot. No, I couldn't. But Fort Sumter was interesting because it came down to that, then, what was that fort down in Florida? You know that. What was the fort in Florida that was also kind of, they were both possibly going to be taken over by the South, and we wanted them back. It's not that important, but Sumter was. That was where we came together. Well, something had to happen because a new president, how strong of a new president was he? If they wanted to take over Fort Sumter, I let them do it. Oh my gosh, what did we elect? This country bumpkin. So I couldn't allow that to happen. The South, they had to push forward and take that fort over, or their 11 states eventually would say, what kind of a rebellion is this? What kind of Confederate states? We can't do anything. So they had to, fire the first shot. They had to have something happen. Now, they did fire the first shot, not on our aggression per se. Our ship was stuck in a sandbar out in the ocean. The second time, the first one, what was it, something, man of war or whatever? That came in, but this one didn't. And it was not provoked for them to, otherwise they would have fired on the ship, but they didn't. They fired on the fort itself. So that started things going. Interesting, a phrase I said, I never claimed to control events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. We never, ever, nobody ever thought that it would last for 4 long years. To me, after Fort Sumter, what did I do? I asked for 75,000 state militia, because our military was very, very small, thousands, and a lot of them were out west in California, so we couldn't use them anyway. So I asked for state militias to join up. So I asked for 75,000. Well, that sounds like a good amount. Okay, let's see. Sign up for 3 months, 90 days. We'll march them around a little bit, make sure that they're not Gomer Pyle doing, just make sure they stay in line. And we'll go down there, we'll kick their butt a little bit, they'll give up, they'll come back, and we'll all live happily ever after. Didn't even happen. And other times I would say it's good that the future comes one day at a time. I could not have handled it otherwise. On the left. Yes, sir. Yes. The glasses. Yes.
Speaking of the war, if you would, give a little bit of your perception of your generals, the ones that you had to work with,
Yes.
and the ones who worked with you.
So what I ended up with, you mean? This was very challenging because we had many generals that were political generals, right? They didn't have the military experience. They had money. Many of them started their own units with their own men in their own uniforms, and they wanted to go out and play army men. So it was rather challenging. And as you know, McClellan, he was great with his soldiers. They loved him to death. Why? Because he never put it into battle. That's why. He marched around in a mighty party. And so they just loved him. And so, like, as you probably know, a school teacher with a young'un, when you change school teachers in the middle of the year, the students don't know what to do. They don't know how to react. So the same with the soldiers. You take McClellan out of it altogether and throw this somebody in that maybe from a different theater and they don't know who in the heck he is. They're going to, well, what, you got to build that allegiance up. So it was rather challenging. So I regret bringing McClellan back in again. And Grant was way out west. We heard about him. We knew the things were happening out there, but it wasn't right there. So it took definitely a while to finally come around to say, well, that Grant, he doesn't back out. There was no reverse on his horse. He just, he's a typical male. If he loses his way, he just keeps going forward. Until eventually he finds the trail again. That's what we needed. And he also got the whole picture. He got the whole strategy. Besides winning battles, he knew how to manipulate the whole theater in the east and the west. He knew how to do all that. So that's why we needed it. And sadly, the South didn't have that. General Lee wasn't that good. The problem with the South also, I don't know why I bring up the South, but I bring up the South because I like to talk. the South, a Southern soldier in the South, his allegiance was to his country. Virginia, Tennessee, South Carolina, that was his country. You're not going to get him to cross the border over to Mississippi and give his life. No, I am in South Carolina. So it was rather challenging for the South to get units together and march places. It wasn't that easy. It was rather challenging for the South. So that was another bad thing about the South. There's another question back there, and then I'll get to you. Let's see, who's the second one? Did that kind of answer your question? Okay, yes, sir.
I didn't realize that there were 1 million slaves in the North. Would you describe that more?
Well, we abolished slavery in the North, right? Pretty much the northern states eventually abolished slavery, but they've been around since, well, I don't know, the Pilgrims, but they've been around a heck of a long time. So there were all these slaves there, and, you know, they just, maybe you could say they were free, but were they really free? No, not really. You know, it was...
Kentucky and
So
Maryland.
they were, pardon?
Kentucky and Maryland were both slave states, but they stayed in the Union.
Half of them. Half of them stayed in the Union. The northern part of those states were for the Union, the southern part was the South. We let a lot of shenanigans go on in Kentucky and Missouri and all just, well, we needed in Maryland. Oh my gosh. I pulled some shenanigans in Maryland. I'll apologize now. I did pull some shenanigans with their government. We kind of kicked them out and maybe threw a couple of them in jail, stuff like that. But like I said, I didn't do everything totally right, but whatever I did was for the good of the country. In my opinion, I didn't do anything that wasn't for the good of the country. But yes, they did. But yeah, the slaves up north, yes, they were indentured servants, maybe you could say. So I mean, we never had any. So the whole thing, you could probably read a book about that, more than what I can explain about the slaves up north. And that's part of the. Like I said about earlier, the slaves from down south had to go all the way to Canada because they didn't want any more up there. They had enough. Because if we freed all the slaves from the south and you went up north, they would take all the jobs, all the menial jobs, and the price of labor would drop. So the north didn't want the slaves either. So they said, keep moving, keep that Underground Railroad keeps going up to Canada. That's why there's so many up in Canada. Because they're not cold, it's not close to Africa. So, I guess you, my dear, you had a question.
Knowing that you had received assassination
Threats.
thank you, why did you choose Johnson as your vice president?
I didn't choose either of my vice presidents. They were chosen by the party. I never even met them until we were being sworn in Washington. Yeah, they were totally different back then. I was up for vice president at the very beginning, or at least it was tossed around there. Well, let's make that their country bumped in a vice president. Mary, of course, wouldn't put up with that. No way, you're not going to be vice president. So yeah, it was not much of a job. So like I said, I had nothing to do with it. The party did because they were hoping for the Southern vote, because he had Southern sympathies. So I said, well, we'll just do that. But Hamlin, I knew nothing about him at all. So yeah, but the party did that. And they were hoping for, like I said, the Southern vote. It didn't turn out well after my early retirement. No, it didn't end up the way that I wanted it to end up. And many, even in the South, said that the worst thing that happened to the South was my assassination. And you don't assassinate the president. It had never been done before. So, I mean, I was the first. But yeah, you may disagree, but yeah, you don't do that. You had a question, sir?
Did you have any opinion about your counterpart in the Confederacy,
Jefferson Davis?
Yes.
An opinion, well, I knew he had a losing job. It was just too frustrating for him to try. And their Constitution was patterned after ours. So, I mean, it kind of had the same things going, other than they would comment that the cornerstone of the Confederacy was slavery. You know, so they had the laws having to do with that. At the end, I was hoping that he would just disappear. And a lot of them went down to Argentina, I think. Just keep moving on down. Because otherwise it would never end if we started to prosecute generals and soldiers and officers. And, you know, we did as much as we could with making sure that those that were governors and in state offices didn't come right back again and start this all over again. But I would never acknowledge him. I called him Jeff. Maybe that was a slang for, you know, for my opinion of him. But I would never, ever acknowledge that he was the president, because he wasn't. I never met him. I never wanted to meet him. They wanted to meet many times. I said, no. I knew Alexander Stevens, his vice president. We knew each other. We were friends. So I said, well, I'll meet with Little Alec, because I call him Little Alec. He's a guy like this short. And so we met a couple of times. But I would never acknowledge Jeff Davis. No. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, would you settle a controversy? Did you write that beautiful condolence letter to Mrs. Bixby, or did one of your secretaries write it?
Wow, isn't that interesting? I haven't checked the writing on it to see for sure. Interesting, isn't it? Now, hopefully it came across today that I wear my feelings on my sleeve. So when I hear things, stories like that, then I take it to heart. And actually, I would think, I'm guessing, because remember, things kind of fuzzy. I had a head injury, so I can't remember everything. Yeah, that was a lousy excuse. I would say that I would have wanted to write that letter myself, just because of, they presented the issue to me of her and her sons, so it was presented to me by them, but I think for me, I would say I would have written that letter, yes, myself personally. And I did write many letters. You know, they said, you're wasting your time writing letters and visiting the people. I would have them come in the morning and the evening. They would wait at the White House, stand in line for me to talk to me. And at the beginning, they just wanted to look at me. They wanted to say, well, who is this guy reelected? Or if their barn burned down, they wanted me maybe, well, who can help me build my barn? Or the cow died, or something like that. They wanted to give me things. I would get furniture. I would get a cured ham and things like that. I got a turkey one time, and then goats. So they would hand us stuff here in Washington, and then my secretaries would say, Mr. Lincoln, you're spending too much time with them. We got, you know, other things to do. I said, well, I'm the people's president. The doors have to be open for them. But also they would take souvenirs. You know how people take souvenirs? While they're standing in line, they would like peel a little wallpaper off. They would cut some of the fabric on the draperies. That was one reason why Mary wanted to refurbish the White House. You know, she spent a lot of money on the White House because she felt, well, other kings and dictators have these beautiful mansions. Why does the President of the United States not have a beautiful place? So that's why she wanted to improve it. And every other president before me, when everybody left, they would take souvenirs themselves home, being in the White House or in Washington. So it was in pretty much shambles. So that was kind of the reason she did that. Anybody else? And then I will got a couple things up here that I would like to talk about, if I may. Okay, first of all, these are real Confederate money. I don't have $1,000 bill because they want like $50,000 for one. They only made like I think 300 or 400 of them. So unless someone wants to donate, I will definitely accept that. And then right here we have my wife Diana. I don't know if you. Okay. We have a couple of. This is weird, but it was fashionable back then. We had a couple of hairs of mine on top of my head, and then a couple of hairs of Mary Todd. Mary Todd? No, Mary Lincoln. And that was fashionable back then. We would receive letters in Washington, people saying, could you send me a lock of your hair? That was a souvenir. That was something, so then we would do that. So some of them that are here now, they would just cut them up into small pieces, so we've got some of that. We have a letter signed by Mary Lincoln. She was in the White House as the president's wife, and you got free postage. Well, how did they know that? Well, the person, the politician, would sign their name up where the stamp was. So this was signed Mary Lincoln. You can't really see from there, but it has a black border around it, because at the time, she was grieving our son Willie had passed away. They grieved for a year. There would be black crepe paper put over the windows. Everything was black. The stationery was black. They were dressed in black clothes. And after about a year, I think it was a year, wasn't it? Then you would change to gray for a short period of time, and then you change to purple. But imagine how much death and sorrow there was back then. You think you'd be in mourning the whole time? Right. And another artifact that I have kind of has to do with this. This isn't it. It's rather challenging to find a set of shackles that were actually slave shackles, so I have not found them yet. But this pertains to what I have over here. What these are, I'd like you to come up later, if you don't mind. Slave receipts. People buying people in the land of the free, here in America, the United States. Up here, they bought a whole family. It was $3,500, and they purchased, let's see, Isaiah, Cynthia, John, Nellie, all the way down to 2 years old. The whole family. And then the one down here was a young lady, Melinda, 12 or 13 years old, not sure, for $960. And they came with a guarantee. Guaranteed to be free of any other owner and guaranteed to be slaves for life. In the land of the free. What the heck is that all about? And then, like I said, those are real. I really love those. Okay, the last thing, which I just purchased recently, I had to beg my wife to get it. I had to justify it, and I think I did, because this is a a document that put in Captain Foote of the Navy to making him a captain, and it is signed by Abraham Lincoln. I signed that myself. So I thought, whoa, what else? What more could you want? My own signature. So and then Gideon Wells, the Secretary of Navy, is also signed it. So that's kind of my thing. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.